only in this way, I think you can see that you can understand the history of the United States, like how and why things happened the way they happened. Like, for example, the Civil War was not about slavery at all. It was about the competition for these Western lands. Like, who's going to build the railroads there? Who's going to develop them? Who's going to become filthy rich from them, right?
Greetings, this is Eugene the Philosopher, the greatest living philosopher after the unfortunate passing of Quentin Robert de Nederland, who has been the greatest living philosopher before me. In this video, we're going to be talking about the logistical theory of civilization. So we're going to be talking about the fact that logistics is the key for civilization. So the big chunk of this video is the theory itself, where we talk about what civilization is and isn't, if you wish. Following the titles of some of my previous videos. Then a big chunk of this video is the demonstration of applicability of this theory on the case of New York. So we're going to look at why New York became so powerful, one of the, if not the most powerful cities in the world, okay? So if you're interested in a history of the United States, you're welcome to watch. Then there's going to be a couple of rants about Mongolian Empire, wink wink, and Egypt as well. And also at the very end we discuss the ley line theory. And spoiler alert, it's not at all what you think it is. So again, you're welcome to pay attention. And also there's a small musical surprise for you at the very end. So let's roll.
Okay, so the theory we're going to discuss is called the logistical theory of civilization. Its author is Igor Shkurin, or Igor Shkurin, I don't know how you would pronounce it in English, aka Igor Grek is his nickname, I guess. Unfortunately, as you can see, he's not alive anymore. But he was a really bright-minded individual. In fact, spoiler alert, in the next video I'm probably gonna give you another theory of his concerning witches. Spooky. Anyway, if you're curious how he looked like, that's how. This is a screenshot from one of his videos from like, I don't know, 7-10 years ago, something like that. And it's a really interesting theory, so let's get on with it. To overview it, I would say that it is an instrument and not a dogmatic setup. And as such, as an instrument, it is pretty narrow. But at the same time, I would say it is a paradigm of sorts. And my definition of paradigm would be just a way of looking at things. And as such, as a paradigm, it is pretty wide, actually. Okay, so it would help us answer questions like why civilizations rise and fall, why do they rise here and not there, etc., etc., etc. It is by design very materialistic because it's focused on resources. You might say actually not really materialistic as much as technocratic, in fact, but by proxy materialistic as well. So we're not going to be concerned with made-up stories like the guy saw a vision and built a city on this hill, you know, the kind of stories you find even in historical textbooks, which stem from basic misunderstanding of power and the basics of material networks, you know. Like if you build a city on a hill that has no resources around it, it will just die out, or you know, your subjects will screw you up or something like that, you know. Stupid kings don't live very long, you know, if they abuse their subjects. Anyway, the theory deliberately ignores culturological, religious, and ideological judgments. So it is designed, again, to be very dry. In fact, as dry as possible, pun intended. You wouldn't understand yet why it is a pun, but hopefully you will figure it out later. So the basic tenets of this theory is that, first, any people, again, we are, you know, not judgmental. So any people produce and consume resources. That's why we're not judgmental. But we have to ask the questions, where are these resources produced and how are they transported, right, to the place of their consumption? And what is the temporal dynamics of such production and transportation? Spoiler alert, this would allow us to answer these kinds of questions. All right, and so the main statement that Shkurin makes is that logistics is a conditio sine qua non of a civilization, and in case you're not familiar with this Latin phrase, it means a condition without which it is impossible to You know? So the condition without which civilization doesn't exist, to speak plainly. So what is logistics? Well, it is organization of rational movement of goods and services from producers to consumers. And it's actually much more complex than it may sound on the surface, because it includes everything like planning, storage, infrastructure, maintenance, trade itself, because it's also, in a way, it's a movement, you know, of goods and services. At least shifting the owner, so to speak, etc., etc. So there is a quote which Shkurin gives in the book. By the way, I completely forgot. We're talking about this book. Yeah, the book from 2013. I will give all the links I'm showing to you, at least the necessary ones, in the description, so don't worry. Including the link to this book. It's free to read, and the text is searchable, so it's in Russian, but you can use the machine translation as much as you like. Okay, so somewhere in this book, this whole video is, I'm loosely reading the book together with you and making some of my own comments. Basically, this is what this video is about, all right? So the idea is, again, belongs to Igor Shkurin, and the comments belong to me, but obviously I'm going to show you some visuals. Yeah, so somewhere along the lines, he makes this quote, which he actually says, I don't know the author myself, okay? So somebody must have said this sometime, that real history books are accounting books. You know, the books that deal with logistics, exactly, right? Like where something comes in and something goes out, you know, we have a debit and credit or whatever, however you call it in English. Okay, so let's take a look at some of the basic division of societies that we may make according to the way they are managing their resources, let's put it this way. And there are two types of societies in this respect. This is primeval societies. These are the ones where we have subsistence economy, which means that whatever we produce, we consume, and vice versa, okay? And there are civilized societies which are based on trade. So we produce something that other people consume, and we consume that other people have produced, okay? So we have to trade. It is a necessary prerequisite. And this is the main difference. It's, again, how do we manage resources? Do we consume what we produce, or do we consume what others produce? In which case we need trade, right? And both societies obviously can coexist perfectly well, right? You can have a primeval society in one spot and a civilized society in another. So this makes, you know, the Stone Age, Bronze Age, Iron Age, or Industrial Age, all of this is an illusion essentially, because all of these ages can actually coexist in the same time frame, right? Because, for example, Stone Age has been observed well into the 19th century. Like in some places, if we take Aborigines of Africa and Australia, it's basically up to the present moment, right? They're in a Stone Age, essentially. And again, I have to underline, this is not an ideological division. Like, we don't say that civilized or Stone Age or whatever is better than the other. It's just an objective division, all right? Like primeval societies produce whatever they consume. Civilized society, like even a primeval society with some metallurgy is obviously possible, right? If they can produce the metals themselves, they will be in whatever metal kind of age, right? Etc., etc. Hopefully that this is understood. So again, the age approach is an illusion. Because these societies, whatever the technological level, whatever the religion, the ideology, the race, the religion, I probably repeated religion twice, it doesn't matter, right? We're only dividing them by the way they manage resources. So even today, many primeval societies exist, and many others existed not so long ago. For example, the curious case of people in Lotschental Valley in Switzerland. So there have been around 2,000 of them. So it's, about the maximal scale, I would say, that a primeval society can reach, just because if you get bigger, you don't have enough food, but we'll talk about this in a minute. So they lived in a primeval way all the way into the 20th century, because they were isolated in a valley, okay, and there were simply no access into it, but they lived absolutely fine in it. All the way until, the Swiss people started building some tunnels around them. So yeah, they had no connections to the outside world. They had no doctors, no police, no anything like that, and they've been absolutely fine. Okay, again, I'm not sure what kind of metal work they've had. They may have had some. They may have had none. Actually, you know, so they technically would be in a Stone Age as well, but don't quote me on that. I don't know these details. I'm just saying that they were primeval in this sense, right? So yeah, obviously, on this example and on many others, we see that such societies do not depend on civilization or on each other, by the way, in any way possible. But civilized people, by definition, do depend on each other. Like civilized societies depend on each other because they depend on trade, and they depend on the producers, the primeval societies. All right. So in an Aboriginal society, a curious fact for you, for example, in Africa or Australia, only about 15 hours of work per week per adult person is required to keep the society well maintained, let's put it this way, which is quite curious, don't you think? Like it's 2 8-hour days of work per week, right? So it's not like it's a very inefficient way to exist. It's just that you cannot have too many people because you would run out of food pretty soon, right? But a society of like 200 or maybe up to a couple of thousand people, even in good conditions, can perfectly exist like this. So let's talk about the types of settlements corresponding to these, not civilizational, societal organizational structures, let's put it this way. So the village is the basic settlement. I mean, all these terms are, provisional. Like you may make up your own terms, but let's try to use some regularly understood ones. So the village is the basic settlement of a primeval society, and it can exist in complete isolation from other villages and cities. Again, anywhere where there is enough resources. So roughly speaking, where a village can produce enough food for itself and other resources for that matter, it doesn't need anyone else, okay? But a city, which is a main type of settlement of a civilization type of society, is a completely different beast. It depends directly on resources produced elsewhere. First and foremost, the food, obviously, but not only, okay? So the city is the main vehicle of civilization. You may say that the city is equivalent to civilization in the first place. Of course, by the way, one thing I should have noticed is that this is not a black and white division, obviously, okay? It's more like shades of gray. But the ends of the spectrum represent a pretty stark contrast, okay? Like you can have a village that every now and then trades with someone, and you can have a city with, I don't know, a couple of farms within this city walls or something. But it's still a city, and it's still a village, okay? Yeah. So, in some sense, because cities depend on others, they are parasitic, but only in the sense that it's not like they don't provide anything, right? Because trade is voluntary, at least, the idea of trade is that it is voluntary. Otherwise, it's a robbery, not a trade, right? And I can give you another example in the human body. Like in the same sense, the brain is parasitic. Just like a city, that like the brain produces no food, Instead, it takes food from other organs, from the blood that your digestive system produces, etc. But you need the brain, right? Otherwise, you wouldn't be so cool, right? Anyway, so civilized and primeval ways of being are very different, again, which stems from the basic difference between them. The basic difference in management of resources type of respect. So the cities provide unique services to villages. Again, for example, they can trade stuff there and quite easily can subjugate them. Because usually cities are reinforced, all right? So they are much more ordered, etc., etc., etc. So a city might be a meeting place, for example, for several villages. And in this way, it is kind of a parasiting on a few villages. So subjugate, I take it in quotation marks, obviously, right? So it's still you might argue that it is a mutually beneficial arrangement. But anyway, what I'm concerned with here is that the more villages a city subjugates in this way, the stronger it becomes, right? And but still the logical structure is that the city needs a village to survive because it cannot produce its own food, but a village does not need a city to survive because, again, it's primeval, right? It's a subsistence economy, or subsistence, actually don't know. Yes, so cities can only appear at trade routes. Why do we make this statement? Well, it's because cities rely on trade, right? They can only consume what others have produced, and you need to transport this, and vice versa. So yeah, where resources produced by other cities and villages can be accessed via these trade routes. So if you block the trade, the city dies, or it may turn into a village, maybe, if there's enough resources nearby, okay, without the trade. So the villages are usually small because there's not much food and other resources to be found nearby. Like, you can only walk so much, in a day. But cities can be arbitrarily big, depending on the thickness of trade routes, depending on the influx of resources from other places, okay? So if there are too many people in a city, for example, a part of them, usually it's the most capable and expendable part of people, aka young men. We might go into a discussion why I call them the most capable and expendable. You're welcome in the comments. They might go elsewhere and make what is called a colony, okay? So they would be still linked to their mother city, so to speak, and thus they will start trading with them, right? So we will have, this is the basic pattern of civilization, aka colonization in this case, but in this respect these terms are interchangeable, all right? So you have two connected cities that constantly trade between each other, the metropole, the mother city, literally from Greek, and the colony, right? So yeah, this is the basic pattern of spreading of civilization, or you may call it colonization, but I'm using it in a neutral kind of way, right? Obviously, with all the post-colonial studies, this term has become somewhat of a slur, actually, but we're using it in a neutral kind of way. Again, I have to reinforce once again, like, we're not saying that something is better than the other, right? We're trying to be as dry and down to earth as possible, without any judgments, without any comparisons of this kind of sort, I guess. Okay, so let's get closer to the very idea of why do we even call it a logistical theory? Like, what about logistics, the transportation? So now we've established the basic pattern. We need at least a couple of cities connected to each other, and maybe a bunch of villages as well, by trade routes, okay? So how were they connected? How did they transport the stuff and people around, okay? And this is one of the main things you have to realize, which still many historians do not, and we'll talk about this quite a lot today, is that up until the second half of 19th century, the main trade routes, the main means of transportation, the main roads were the sea and the rivers, all right? Now, in case you are so all the way from the beginning of time and up to the second half of the 19th century, that was the case. And you might ask, well, what happened in the second half of the 19th century? Well, railroads appeared. That's what happened. Obviously, later on, automobile transport appeared, and later on, even aviation appeared, right? But for the absolute majority of human history, and even prehistory, the main roads were the sea and the rivers. Okay. So the empty map, where there's no land, where there's only water, is actually the most important in civilizational development, according to logistical theory, because again, we've made this statement that the logistics is a condition without which civilization is impossible, and logistics relies on the seas and rivers, right? Otherwise, the civilized society cannot trade, and therefore it cannot exist. Do you see the logic? Hopefully you do. I mean, it's really simple. There's nothing complex here. So this is kind of my comment. You know, I want it to be fancy. I mean, obviously dark matter theory in physics is BS, but still it's kind of a meme. It's kind of this invisible majority, so to speak, the invisible most important part. So yeah, so I'm using it in this way here. So the seas and the rivers are actually the dark matter of history, or at least the dark matter of logistics that you don't see, but which is very important. And again, I'll demonstrate this to you following Shkurin on the case of the development of the United States, or the colonization thereof, if you wish. Yeah. So thus civilization can only spread upwards from the sea into the continent through rivers. So, and it does so only if there are some resources worthy of going there in the first place, you know. So cities linked by the sea and the rivers might form various topologies. This is like Shkurin spends some time, like a few pages, talking about the various topologies, and he says that you can use something like a graph theory to analyze this, to analyze the various structures that cities form together, like a line, you know, like a tree, like a star, you know, things like that. But I don't think it's worth talking about for a lot, so I'm just kind of skipping this because I mean it's kind of self-evident, right? So yeah, one problem we encounter when we try to analyze the logistical structures is that they are kind of virtual, in the sense that, you know, the stuff is moving, you know, it's dynamic. You cannot take a snapshot of it, right? However, what makes this theory sort of, I guess, falsifiable, actually, you know, scientific, is that there is always some material evidence, even in the past, when we're trying to analyze history on the rails of, or on the boats, if you wish, of this logistical theory of civilization, right? Because there are always traces of resource production, such as, for example, I don't know, abandoned quarries or things like that, and consumption, right? There are traces of trade routes. There are perhaps abandoned, like, you know, remnants of vehicles, like, again, boats or wagons or something like that. I don't know. And there are obviously cities themselves, again, which relied on all of this infrastructure in the first place, right? The cities as the only places where civilization actually exists. Okay. So according to Shkurin, the main goal of history, at least in this respect, but I would even add in general, has to be to determine the logistics of transportation of goods and services based on objective and material evidence. So this makes it scientific. And only after this, the written sources should be looked at, okay? If the written sources do not correspond to logistical considerations, they must be effectively equated to folklore and mythology, okay? Tolkien might write about orcs and elves and whatever else, you know, but unless we see actual, you know, signs of their presence from the logistical standpoint, from the material standpoint, we still think it's mythology, right? It's folklore. It's literature, if you wish. So, yeah. Logistical infrastructure must be perceived as a skeleton of civilized society and thus of history in the first place, because again, history only exists for civilized societies. So yeah, and here I want to go on a bit of a rant. Actually, Shkurin does not talk about this a whole lot in his book. Actually, I have to note, like in his book, his tone is very light-hearted, you know, almost playful. Like, but yeah, but I'm gonna be sounding pretty angry sometimes in this video, so I apologize for that. But just some things are so preposterous that, you know, my tolerance for bullshit is quite low these days. So things like Mongolian Empire. This is folklore and mythology. This is Tolkien. Like, I'm sorry. Let's just think about this. Like, again, we have to have all of this, right? All of this evidence to say that Mongolian Empire existed. The problem is we have none. But let's get to it. So Mongolia is the fourth coldest country in the world. It has 2 people per kilometer squared of population density right now. I underline this with 21st century agriculture, whereas the world average, even including, Greenland, Antarctica, Sahara Desert, is 50 people. So Mongolia today, not like 1,000 years ago, but today, has 25 times smaller population density on average than Antarctica. Okay, I know I'm kind of exaggerating, but not really, to be honest. Okay, and suddenly it becomes a huge empire and conquers everyone with, again, zero material evidence. We have none of this. You may say, well, what do you mean? Like, we have 5 arrowheads, supposedly Mongolian ones. We have 15 helmets in the museums in Berlin and wherever else, in Louvre, or I don't know where. But I'm talking about 0 in orders of magnitude, Of course, there might have been 15 helmets. I'm fine with that. But there have been 0 logistical prerequisites. And just think about this for a moment. Allegedly, according to our mythology, according to our Tolkien literature, Genghis Khan had 100,000, more than that actually, troops, okay, plus the same amount of horses at the very least, which in Roman terms, in ancient Roman terms, that would be 20 legions, okay? Whereas the Roman Empire proper, even at its height, had something like 35. So this empire should have been logistically almost equivalent to the Roman Empire. Well, we have plenty of material evidence, logistical evidence, all of this from the Roman Empire, right? And we have, that's why I say we have 0 from the Mongols. It's not even close, 5 arrowhead, I'm exaggerating, obviously. But you see the problem here, right? And then they say when they attacked Russia, they had 400,000 people, which is completely insane. It's like an army of Napoleon, So yeah, just how are you gonna feed these people with this sort of food production today? How are you gonna pay these people? Oh wait, I found this gem, okay, and I want to show it to you. Oh, and by the way, I wanted to show you previously that I have had this older video, Cities versus Villages. I'm gonna link all of this again in the description. But there I consider, I should have said this when we had this, we talked about this division, right, between where resources are produced. But I was talking about it in a cultural aspect, okay? But here we're talking about the resource aspect, so it's slightly different. Anyway, let's return to this gem. Mongolian nomads have minted coins. Where did I get this beautiful phrase? Well, it's this website. Let's read this. Unfortunately, I cannot highlight, but hopefully you can see my cursor. So, Mongolian nomads have minted coins. Let me repeat that. Mongolian nomads have minted coins. Mongolian nomads have minted coins. I don't think I made any mistakes here, right? I've read this correctly. So, Mongolian nomads have minted coins. Mongolian nomads have minted coins. Mongolian nomads have minted coins. I will not comment on this, okay? Yeah, it's just not something that can happen. By this, I mean this, the Mongolian Empire. It's not something that can happen in the real world. I'm sorry. This is a myth. Unless you believe in literal miracles, in literal religious sense of the word. You should just abandon the concept. It's Tolkien, even simple questions, where's my iron? How do I make weapons for these people? Again, we already figured out that they've minted coins, so we can pay people. We have gold mines, silver mines, we have plenty of money, so we can pay to our people. How do we make iron for chainmails? For example, in case you're not aware, like in order to have a good enough quality iron without too many defects, so you can make a wire, you know, for a chainmail that you can later on turn into rings and interlock them, you need a really good quality iron. But a really good quality iron comes with a blast furnace, but was only invented in late 1400s in Europe. Of course, there are Chinese blast furnaces that function for 5 billion years, but we're not talking about these ones, okay? It's also Tolkien, long story short. But, I mean, okay. Hopefully you get the idea, right? There is zero logistical evidence that any of this was possible. It just makes no sense. It's literature, it's folklore, it's mythology. I'm sorry. Yeah. It's not like I have to prove to you that this is impossible. You have to prove to me that this is possible, you know? Where's the evidence? Like, where's my... forget about it. Okay, what are the main goals of cities? So the Mongolian rant over. It's transportation, storage, and trade of the resources produced nearby and elsewhere, of course, right? Because cities depend on stuff produced elsewhere. Thus, cities must have been highly organized and reinforced, ready to defend themselves. We've already talked about this previously. So to make a new city, we basically, what do we need? We need to have some resource. So civilization would become interested to come there, right? And produce, like not produce, create a city there. Then the resources should be valuable enough, and we should have enough technology to even produce, or I mean, mine, or whatever the verb you want to use here, to produce these resources. I guess not it, but them, I don't know. And there can be roads made to this place. Again, we remember that up until the middle of the 19th century, 1860s even, that would mean the rivers should be there, right? And it is profitable to produce the resource in this place rather than elsewhere. For example, the question of how do civilizations fall, right? How do cities, for example, decay, boils down to this exact point, that the city usually decays. We'll come back to it later, but I'm kind of like spoilering it here. The city can only disappear and decay only if it became more profitable to produce the resource that the city was producing elsewhere, okay? Yeah, so the main points of the theory. I'm trying to accelerate a little bit. Civilization is a system of interconnected cities, as we've already discussed. Cities are sort of like islands in the sea of villages and primeval societies, aka, well, villages, yeah. Civilization comes from the sea. The sea is like the ultimate road, you know, and gets into land through rivers. Like, when I was writing the notes, I kind of joked to myself that the civilization is kind of like Cthulhu, you know, in H.P. Lovecraft's mythology. It's like you don't exactly see it, right? Because logistics is virtual, but you know it lives somewhere in the sea, you know? And it kind of spreads its tentacles through rivers upstream, you know? It climbs into the... I guess you can call it the Cthulhu model of civilization. But obviously, with respect to Igor Shkurin, I wouldn't do that. But I thought it was funny. Maybe it would help you kind of visualize it better, okay? So, I mean, you may use an octopus instead of Cthulhu, okay? So, the cities are founded along the rivers, approximately one day of travel apart. Again, because we're transporting stuff along the, not along, but by the rivers, considering the place is safe enough. And the best safe place is the island in the river itself, but any sort of place like this would do. Development of a city is determined by the volume of resources flowing, either literally or metaphorically through it, okay? When I'm saying literally, it means by the river. And the city, lower down by the same river, aggregate pretty much all the resources from upstream, okay? And thus they become main hubs, often the capitals. That's why you often see the biggest cities right at the shore in the mouth of some river, okay? I'm not even gonna give you any examples. You know them well enough yourself. And once again, I have to underline that these rules are true with very few exceptions, and up until the second half of 19th century, when railroads became more important. So this theory works the best up until, I would say, 20th century, roughly, even, you know. I'll give you maybe one example when it works even after that. I actually don't remember if I have it. Anyway. But let's ask us a rhetorical question, like how many historians do you think are hydrologists? How many historians actually think about the rivers in the first place when they talk about the civilizational development? Because we've just shown that it is crucial. The river transportation network is crucial for the development of civilization because these are the roads, okay? And how many of the historians are actually know anything about the rivers in the region they're studying, like in good enough detail that they would know whether the river is actually traversable, about the tributaries, the canals, how it actually changed over time, etc., etc. And in this case, like when I was writing the notes, I kind of again remembered this other theory, let's call it this way, about sphinx. You know, Robert Schoch, and I got so pissed off that I have to go on another rant, okay? Prepare. So, who is Robert Schoch? So, he's known for this erosion hypothesis of sphinx. So, the idea is 10 million years ago, I'm exaggerating because I'm pissed off, I'm sorry. Maybe 10,000 years ago, let's put it this way, there existed a super advanced civilization that built the sphinx. So, the sphinx must be 10,000 years old. Why? Because it has signs of water erosion, okay? And so the climate must have been more wet 10,000 years ago. There were rains. The rains caused the water erosion on the Sphinx. That's how we conclude it must be 10,000 years old. That's the logic, okay? There is a big problem with this. Again, Mr. Schoch, as well as the other guy who authored the theory, I think, who was it? John Anthony West. They're definitely not hydrologists. Definitely not. Why is that? Well, somehow they do not know about the phenomenon of the flooding of the Nile. All right? What is the flooding of the Nile? Well, it's when in Cairo, for example, where Sphinx is situated, the level of the river rises 7.6 meters. That's a lot, right? In fact, I'm trying to put it as diplomatically as possible, all right? Like, let's start at the very beginning. Even school students know that the very existence of Egypt depends on the Nile, right? So maybe when you're starting to talk about the history of Egypt, you have to look at the Nile River, how it behaves, the basic geography, you know, the basic facts like this one. So in Cairo, the river goes up 7.6 meters. In fact, they even have a festival devoted to it in August 15th. I actually opened some paper about this. Look at this. Whoa! And then it goes down again. So around August, like late August, is the peak of the flooding, right? This is actually not Egypt, it's Aswan. I mean, it's upstream. I mean, not Cairo at the very least. And this is, so why don't we see it? Why isn't there water right now? Well, because, my friends, I'll show you the elevation right now. Because in 1960s, people have built a huge dam on the Nile River. Right? It's called the Aswan Dam. It's right here. Very, very far away. But this has effectively stopped the flooding of the Nile. It also created this huge artificial lake, I guess. So yeah, where am I going with this? Well, if you know about the flooding of the Nile, and if you look at the profile of the terrain, so here we have the base of the Sphinx, right? It's this left point. Note, 19 meters above sea level. And here we have the modern level of the Nile River, which is probably lower than the ancient one, but we can't be sure. But at least let's take the modern one. Has 16 meters above sea level, right? So the height of the base of the Sphinx is 19 above sea. The height of the Nile itself is 16 above sea. Ha! And it floods every year almost 8 meters at Cairo. So we have a 3-meter difference. The Sphinx is 3 meters above river, and the river rises 8 meters. What do we conclude? The lowest 5 meters of Sphinx would be below the Nile level. It would be flooded every year for at least, let's say, 3-4 centuries, conservatively. Okay? Why do I say 4 centuries? It's because I want to advertise another video of mine. If you want to know more about the more realistic story of pyramids, go and take a look at my video over here, okay? So yeah, the lowest, at least 5 meters of the Sphinx were flooded yearly for centuries. That gives you more than enough of water erosion, okay? You don't need 10,000 years of Tolkien civilizations, of, how do they call it? Silmarillion, you know? The Atlantis, the Nibelung, like whatever, you know? The dwarves mining the limestone for the Sphinx or whatever. You don't need all of this. Basic geography, like middle school level actually, would answer your question. And I'm sure there are tens of thousands of people who still think that this idea is correct. And I'm really pissed off at it, right? The basic school geography would give you all the answers you need, right? And a little bit of history. You need to know about the Aswan Dam, okay? But anyway, it's very sad. That's why I'm so pissed off. Okay, rant over. Let's evaluate the logistical theory of civilization on a case study. Let's take a look at history of New York. Now, why are we using New York as an example? Because it's well-observed history. Again, no Tolkien here. We know how it was developed because it's well-observed history. A lot of documents, periodic print, no room for document falsification. Well, at least on a large scale, okay? And no mythology, no Tolkien here, right? We see it. Not literally, metaphorically at least, right? So let's try to answer the question with the help of, does the development of New York correspond to all of the points we've raised previously? I mean, really, Shkurin raised, but I'm just kind of acting as his herald, basically. So why did New York become the city? You know, basically, if you ask someone what is the city, they'll probably think of New York, maybe about London, maybe about Paris, but New York would definitely be in top 3, okay? So yeah, let's refresh our ideas. So firstly, the Cthulhu model, right? The octopus civilization comes from the sea because it's like the road, the main road, right? Okay. And indeed, the original 13 colonies, they were obviously founded by the sea, okay? Then what it does, it enters the land through rivers, okay? And indeed, there are rivers. I'll show you a little bit later. Actually, maybe let me show you right now. Yeah, I have a bunch of maps here. This is a really good one. Again, I'm giving all the links. So these rivers, I'll try to get a zoom level good enough. So you see, we have the Appalachian Mountains, right? This big ridge, and the rivers flowing from it into the ocean, like this. And so civilization enters by the sea and upstream by the rivers, okay? That's how the colonization happens, or the civilization spreads, you might call it that as well. Like this. That's why we have this, right? Makes sense? So far, I think it's perfectly valid. Then, by the way, I'm not gonna look at history of all the United States. We're only talking about New York, but we have to look at the general region, like what happened here in the 13 colonies. Like, for example, why New York was different from Philadelphia. We'll specifically look into this. So cities are founded at roughly 1-day travel intervals along these rivers. I mean, if you're American, if you're curious about your own history, you may try to confirm this, but let's accelerate a little bit. And cities downstream, that is closer to the ocean, gather resources from cities and villages upstream. Okay, that's what we're talking about. Because the trade between the civilization living in the sea and our pieces of civilization living inland on rivers, they communicate through mouths of these rivers, right? So the cities that lie in the mouth of the river would be the most successful ones. The richest ones. However, already from this river structure, the problem is evident that appellations prevent us from going forward because rivers stop there, right? Like you can't traverse the mountains themselves. Like the river just stops at the mountain itself. So how do we get there? How do we keep colonizing over there? Well, obviously, again, you have the Mississippi River, but again, I'm not going to be really concerned by it. Actually, let's make a couple of comments. The French were obviously colonizing mostly through Mississippi, actually. That's why Louisiana was these lands. Like, if you're curious why it has this shape, well, it's because it's the Mississippi Basin. Again, civilization enters from the sea. It spreads upstream through the rivers, in this case, Mississippi River. That's why it has this shape, because it's the basin of Mississippi. And keep in mind, all of these forts, they were incredibly small. That's why they're called forts, right? These are just small trading posts, really. Okay, there weren't much happening over here until the, let's just call them English-speaking. The people from 13 colonies arrived. And this is exactly what we're going to be talking about just now, okay? So yeah, and the French also colonized through St. Lawrence River. So here. So here. Like this, then through these rivers. But maybe we'll return to that a little bit later. Again, we're talking about New York, okay? It's here. Let's forget about it. Again, as an exercise, you may look at the history of French colonization if you wish. Yes, so we have this problem of appellations, right? Up until 1820s, roughly, Delaware River Basin gave the most resources. At that time, by resources, we mostly understand lumber, agricultural goods, and various goods you can get from hunting, such as beaver pelts, for example, okay? And that's why Philadelphia, that was sitting on the Delaware, was the biggest city, because the most resources has been flowing through it. In fact, it was the capital for the longest, I think, until 1800s. Like, they kept moving the capital depending on where the Congress meets. But Philadelphia was certainly the most influential city by then, okay? Because it was feeding off of all of this area, right? The Delaware River, which goes actually up into Catskill Mountains, and this river, whatever it's called, all of this area, okay? So it was pretty rich. Compare this to New York. Actually, we'll talk about New York more. But anyway, suddenly, okay, in 1835, New York surpasses Philadelphia and becomes the most populous, and Philadelphia slowly falls, and it's actually still the most populous than New York. And Philadelphia slowly falls to number 6 in the next 2 centuries. I mean, it's number 6 right now. How did that happen? Well, if we are a regular, folklore type of historian, we just don't even ask this question, right? It just happened. I mean, for historical reasons, right? Which means it just happened. Maybe some guy said, you know, I don't like the name Philadelphia. I want to settle in New York. You know, it sounds cooler. So more people went to New York, right? Maybe that would be an explanation, or some other bullshit explanation like this. But we are, you know, trying to follow basic logic, basic facts, you know, logistics, all right? And the logistics tells us that the key to understanding New York's surge in power is realization that it did find a way around the Appalachians. Okay, and the key event here was the construction of Erie Canal, or Erie, I don't know how you pronounce it. These are the dates. So it began construction in 1817 and finished in 1825. It was built with just horsepower and manpower, I guess. Okay, and there were some expansions. I'm going to show you all these canals just now. I'm just going to list them right away. So there was Oswego, I don't know how it's pronounced, in 1828. Also Champlain, I guess, in 1823. Also Cayuga Seneca in 1818. And thus a big New York State canal system was formed. Okay, let's take a look on the map. So the Erie Canal is right here. So roughly speaking, it connects Lake Erie, that's why it's called such, through these. Okay, let me just show it to you. It goes like this to Albany. Of course, there were rivers here. It's not everywhere that you needed to dig, you know. But I assume they've been mostly digging in this section, and everything else was natural. But still, the canal in its entirety goes from Erie to Albany, to Hudson River here, right? What about the other ones? They're just kind of like extensions of the Erie Canal. So, So Oswego, it's this one, this little one, which connects the whole system to Lake Ontario. Then we have Champlain, I don't know how you pronounce it. It goes here, it connects again Albany to this system, and eventually to St. Lawrence. Then we have Cayuga Seneca, which is a small arm of Erie, I don't know, canal over here, connecting it to this unpronounceable river. And then, this was the guy who was responsible for constructing, you see, the canal. He was actually ridiculed by then. But I must say to you that it was probably the guy who made the America great, you know. If you're trying to make it great again, at least remember who made it great in the first place. It was this guy who built the canal. And I'll try to show to you how, just now, according to the logistical theory of civilization. So let's take a look at what we have in the end. So after the canal, sorry, I should have said canal, has opened in just 10 years, so it opened in 35, and in just 10 years, the colossal amount of resources has flowed through New York, okay? What kinds of resources? Well, if we only could have reached somewhere up to here, I don't actually know where the end was before the canal was constructed. This is obviously a modern map. But roughly speaking, New York was feeding off of this, right? Roughly speaking, of resources in this area. But, well, maybe a little bit of this as well. But when the canal was opened, then all of this area, and you know, these extensions that opened on the whole Ontario, okay, and the canal itself, huge lands over here, and the whole Lake Erie here, and spoiler alert, the whole Great Lakes area in the first place, because you can sail here as well, right? Is sail the right word? I don't know. But eventually, all of this was connected to civilization that lives in the sea, as we remember, through New York. So everything that the people living here are importing is imported through New York and goes like this, right? And everything that the people living here are exporting is exported through New York. Well, maybe not everything, like something goes through St. Lawrence, but it's mostly New York, right? And by sitting in this small bottleneck, it became incredibly rich, incredibly fast, okay? So that's how 10 years after the Erie Canal was opened, New York surpassed Philadelphia and never fell down since. It only continued to grow. So this is, again, if you want, and again, if you look even forward, that's what essentially made the colonization of the whole continent possible in the way it happened, actually. You know, it could have happened otherwise, I mean, by other means, but that was the thing, you know. So again, this guy, this DeWitt Clinton, is the guy who made New York great and by proxy America great. So if we look farther upstream, what happens in the continent, we have Detroit, which used to be a very small fort of like 300 people or something before all of this happened. It started booming, right? Then you can go through it into here, and here, what can we do? We can open the Illinois and Michigan Canal. Which actually happened in 1848. What is this canal doing? It's it links the Lake Michigan to Mississippi River through Illinois, because Illinois River, you see, it's this small canal over here, and by some coincidence, you might say, Chicago sits there, right? Except until the canal, Chicago was also a village, basically. I'll show you the numbers. So it became the gateway into the continent, basically. From the Great Plains, from and to the Great Plains, right? Or what is called in this map, Central Lowland. Like all of this super fertile, super rich soil, huge amounts of lumber, all kinds of stuff, good stuff, right? All of it was exported through Chicago because that was the main highway. Okay, like this, and all of it flowed through New York as well. So as much as Chicago started booming and Detroit started booming, New York started booming tenfold, you know. Like you might say, actually, that Detroit and Chicago are just colonies of New York in this respect, okay? This is exactly this linear graph that we kind of briefly mentioned, right? So in 1840, before the canal appeared, although there were already, a boat connection to New York, Chicago had 5,000 people, so it already started growing relatively fast. But in 1860, 12 years after the canal, it increased 20-fold, 100,000 people. How can you understand this if you don't look at this, at the logistics? Like it just happened, you know? It started booming. Why did it start booming? I don't know. Yeah. I'm a historian. I'm not a scientist, right? I read Tolkien. It's Silmarillion. It started booming. The evil spirits or good spirits, I don't know. Pun intended, you know, in terms of Prohibition era. Anyway. Yeah. And later on, we have the railroads, right? With the first small section of it, the Chicago Galena, or I don't know how you pronounce it, opened in 1850. So in case you were wondering why Chicago became the main railroad hub, well, it's because of this, because otherwise we travel by water, and from here we can sort of, it's already the railroad era, right? It's 1850s. So we start building railroads like this. That's why they look this way, right? From this big node, it grows like a tree there in all directions pretty much, right? Can you see that? I mean, obviously, again, this is a modern map, so there's plenty of other railroads everywhere, but this was the beginning. And this, my friends, shows you the reason for a civil war. What was the reason for civil war? I mean, obviously, you can come up with any sort of conspiracy theories, but realistically, any wars are fought over resources or the control over the resources, right? So what kind of resources are we talking about here? Well, it's all of these territories. It's all of these territories. Basically, the most, in terms of area, the majority of the United States, right? So we've had two projects, roughly speaking. The southernmost, which were colonizing it through here, but they've had their own ways, you know. And the northern one, colonizing it through New York, through this logistical scheme that I've just demonstrated, right? So basically the question was, who is going to build railroads here? And this what was the war was fighting over, right? Yeah. And it wouldn't surprise you in this respect, like why would Pacific Railroad Acts be, what's the word, passed, I don't know, in 1862 when the war was still not over, right? Well, it's because they kind of assumed, well, if we win, we do this, right? What do? We build the Pacific Railroad. We link our transport network over here, our civilization over here, to all the way to there, right? All the way to there. Yeah. And since we are going to build many new roads, many new people would move in, they would start to settle, so we need a Homestead Act as well, right? And the construction of the Pacific Railroad, actually, again, it was in the middle of the war. But the North was kind of already, I mean, assuming they would win, I guess, would be the way to put it. So they started constructing it. Yeah, and since the South has lost, it was the Northern project that has prevailed. And we've ended up with a continuous flow of pioneers through New York to the West. And we have all the Wild West thing going on with, you know, the Indian problem with extermination of bisons and Mustangs. By the problem, I mean genocide, essentially. Let's not use any other word. We have cowboy culture, right? Who were the cowboys? Well, there were plenty of cows who turned into sort of wild cows, the so-called Texas Longhorn, right? They were initially introduced by the Spanish, somewhere here. And there were plenty of these wild cows over here. So the cowboys started like herding these cows and transferring them to Chicago and getting filthy rich from this, okay? That's what the cowboys were doing. And there were so many of these cows that Chicago actually, there was a boom of butcheries. Actually, I should have opened this page. I'm not gonna do it. But it was so big, in fact, that up to 50,000 workers were working just in the butcheries alone in Chicago, right? So yeah, I kind of want to accelerate. So it's a lot of fun to talk about things like this, but I understand how much of a tangent it is to the theory, okay? Hopefully I've demonstrated to you how the history of the United States, this is not all, by the way. I'll give you another example, but still. So everything was started to boom, the industry in Chicago, like canned food, soap, leather production, refrigeration systems starting to be developed to store the meat, you know, from these butcheries, the conveyor systems. Obviously we needed electricity for all of that, the water pumps, etc. The barbed wire was invented in Illinois, again around Chicago, right, to mark the limits of farms for these new settlers, you know, etc., etc., etc. We have a stock exchange, then New York joins, etc. But again, all of this, if you want to export, obviously Chicago boomed because it was feeding off of all of this, right? But by the same token, New York boomed because all of this was exported through it. Obviously, a lot of it was consumed right here, but a lot of it was also exported. And whatever needed to be imported had to be imported through New York again. Yeah. So, again, Chicago is a colony of New York in this respect. Yeah. In fact, about a half of all American imports and exports, all the way into 1920s, were still going through New York. That's how it became the city. And again, why? It was because this guy has built the Erie Canal. Even though he was ridiculed at the time, he was the mayor of New York and the governor of the state of New York. Okay, he wasn't just a random guy. Though he was heavily ridiculed. They called it Clinton Ditch, I think they called it, in the papers, etc. Anyway, this is the guy who made it all possible. I hope you can see that now. And I hope you can see how the logistical theory of civilization explains it all really well. Like, it fits the events really, really well. Amazingly well, in fact. Okay? So we may say, I think, that we have validated the theory. Now, obviously, later on, when we have already railroads, automobiles, the airports, there have been a decline in this import-export because of the development of other better transport terminals, okay? Because again, you can't just use all these canals forever. Their capacity is limited, so that was the case. But again, we're dealing with already almost a post-industrial era, right? Where New York, since then, became a major service, financial, and cultural center anyway. So right now it lives off on a completely different grounds, and right now the logistical theory is not really applicable, at least in the way it was applicable back then, all right? So other considerations, like the world is too global, basically. The civilization is too easy to bring to pretty much anywhere just by building a railroad. Yeah, so, but yeah, only in this way, I think you can see that you can understand the history of the United States, like how and why things happened the way they happened. Like, for example, the Civil War was not about slavery at all. Like, slavery existed forever before that, and it, like, the discrimination, for example, continued for a whole century after that. So it was not about slavery, right? It was about the competition for these Western lands. Like, who's going to build the railroads there? Who's going to develop them? Who's going to become filthy rich from them, right? And the logistical theory of the civilization is the only one that can answer these questions. Not these questions, but yeah, you get the idea. Another example would be a mystery of the Second War of Independence. You see, this war of 1812, as Wikipedia calls it at least, between Britain and United States, right? So 1812 to 1815. Now, if you try to understand what happened by reading some of this, or, you know, reading Tolkien, you wouldn't understand anything, I promise. Like, it makes no sense. It makes absolutely zero sense. However, let's take a look at it logistically. Again, it's all about Erie Canal. What made America great in the first place, right? So the Erie Canal was first proposed actually in 1807, but you may remember that it only started building in 1817. So why the delay? You know, well, it's because the Brits also wanted a piece of the action, right? They wanted control over the access to these Western territories beyond the Appalachians. However, the Brits themselves couldn't get there because they were blocked by Niagara Falls. Let me show you that. Again, Canada is already like British, you might say at this point. Britain is almost the world hegemon. They would become the world hegemon after they beat Napoleon at Waterloo. So, but it's only a few years away, okay? Almost a hegemon. Actually, yeah, a couple of years. But Canada is British, right? We can enter through St. Lawrence and we can get into Lake Ontario, okay? So this is our limit. Like, here we have to use wagons or these smaller rivers. But this is pretty much this is why here is the main Canada. You know, there is of course a cluster over here as well, but it was colonized in a different manner. But this is what people usually mean by Canada, right? This little blip that was colonized through St. Lawrence and these other rivers nearby. Yeah, but the problem is we can't get to Lake Erie because there is this, you see, elevation 74, elevation 174. So there is this Niagara Falls over here, right? That's the problem. So we kind of need access to this canal as well. By we, I mean the British. I'm kind of like, playing for the underdog here. So the fighting in this war, again, this is basically the years when it was clear that the canal would be constructed, right? The fighting was over the control of this future canal system that I've just shown you, like these canals over here. And of course, again, politicians and newspapers would always give you some stupid false premise, just like they do today, just like they did always, right? They always invent some bullshit excuses to attack other people, like Colin Powell, JPEG, In case I have some younger viewers, I would say that Colin Powell is an American politician who falsely accused Iraq for having weapons of mass destruction, which has caused an American invasion of the country, okay? It was early 2000s. Almost 20 years ago, actually. Actually, more than 20 years ago. Crazy. Time flies. Anyways, as a result of the war, the British have lost. So they couldn't control the future canal anymore. So they had to build their own canal in 1824 and 1829. This is the canal. In case you were wondering while I was explaining about Niagara, you would say, well, there is this strip. Well, this is a canal that they've built after the war. But they lost the time, Erie was already there. When was it built? 25, right? 1825. Wait. I lost it, sorry. Yeah, 1825, Erie Canal is already built. And their canal, which is called, I actually have it somewhere here, I remember it. Welland Canal, you see? This one. So it was only built 4 years later, so they were late. They've lost so much tempo that the control over these Western territories, well, first of all, they couldn't prevent the Americans from getting there, right? Because they've had their own Erie Canal. And second of all, they were late. So all the juicy stuff was already taken by the Americans. They've already established their control. So the Brits only had they could trade, I guess, here is the best they could do. But they could never control it anymore. And by the way, again, while I was thinking about this, now Shkurin does not talk about this, but I think that even Franco-Prussian War, which is already well into the railroad era, can still be explained by the logistical theory on the same rails. No pun intended, actually. Because it was not only over the control of the Rhine River, the famous Alsace-Lorraine problem between French and the Germans, but it was also a proxy war. I mean, the Rhine River itself is a huge logistical asset, but also a proxy war over the control of Suez Canal, okay? And Suez Canal was built from 1859 to 1869. Again, we're back into Egypt, boys and girls. So it would make sense for this war to start in 1870. Because you see, Britain already, in late, almost not late, but in Victorian era Britain, almost at the peak of its power, a world hegemon, they were allied to Prussia. Basically, they were kicking S out of people with German hands, so to speak, in Europe. So, yeah. So the thing is, right when the channel opened, canal, sorry, I keep saying channel. It's just that the same word in Russian. That's why I kind of think of it this way. So the Suez Canal opened in 1869, and right away, 3/4 of its capacity was used by the British trade fleet, because it was the biggest in the world. It's no wonder, okay? So the Brits wanted to control it, but the problem is it was controlled almost 50-50 by the Ottomans in the face of their vassal Egypt and the French, okay? So the Brits told the Prussians, can you deal with a bit of a problem for us, You'll get your Alsace and Lorraine for this, and what we get, we won't tell you, okay? We're gonna be fine. So after the French were crushed by the Prussians during this, in 1875, lo and behold, the British became the biggest shareholder. They've had 0 shares before that. And now they are the biggest shareholder. That's very suspicious, right? Of course, those of you who know this story, they might tell you, well, the British mostly bought the Egyptian shares. The French shares were mostly untouched. Yeah, that's true. But if France was still alive, so to speak, it would have prevented this, okay? But France wasn't. It was being dealt with a grunt called Prussia, the ally of Britain. So as you can see, even like if you try to read the like why the war happened in the first place, you wouldn't understand much. It's just that these French and Germans, they're constantly fighting. That's the best explanation you will get. Or at best, again, you would see, okay, Alsace and Lorraine, it's an industrial region, very important, etc., etc. You would completely miss this, right? And it's kind of important, I think. Yeah. All right. We're already over an hour, almost an hour 20, I believe. Whew. Yeah. Let's talk about the disappearance of civilization a little bit. I've hinted at this somewhere at the very beginning. Like, for example, I've spoiled it that we can answer questions like these, right? Why civilizations rise and fall? Well, the thing is, there are bullshit Tolkien explanations. And sorry, I keep saying Tolkien. It's no disrespect to the guy. I'm just, I need some mimetic way to express myself. Like, I actually like Tolkien a lot. But we have these Silmarillion type of explanations like, oh, this civilization lost its passionarity, another term from Lev Gumilov, actually a Russian scientist. Well, I'm not even sure if I can call him a scientist, historian, let's put it this way. Or they underwent cultural decline, the moral decline maybe, or even better, the typical explanation, they were destroyed by barbarians, But you see, the problem is, for example, the same barbarians destroyed most of European cities in 1939, 1945. The proverbial example of lunar landscapes of Dresden. And barbarians also destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. Like, the cities were literally nuked, right? They completely stopped existing. But all of this was rebuilt in a blink of an eye in historical terms, right? None of these civilizations disappeared. Like, why is that? Well, it's because the flow of resources didn't change. Like, the war was for something else entirely, right? In this sense, it was fine. It was an episode, okay? It was like lovers fight, I mean, maybe it's inappropriate to call it that, considering the amount of casualties. But, historically speaking, it didn't change anything, at least in Europe, okay? Actually, I make a remark here. It did change something, but in a positive way. Because after the war, huge amount of investment from America came to both Japan and Europe, right? So if anything, Europe has won the war. Even despite barbarians destroyed Europe and Japan for that matter, right? Yeah. So if the flow, this is the statement, the conclusion we make here. If the flow of resources does not change, civilization does not die out. And again, everything else, explanations like these one, plural, are folklore and mythology. It's Silmarillion. The evil spirits corrupted our leaders, It's this type of explanation. But if the flow of resources does change, like in the case of, again, we saw how all of this boomed, but just as well, it all kind of disboomed, so to speak, fell down later on when, for example, the heavy industrialization of Asia began, right, in the second half of the 20th century, and only accelerated, right? So by the end of 20th century, all of this was already in the state of decay. New York was kind of fine. because it kind of shifted its priorities to culture, to finance, to services, but everything deeper into the continent. There was just no need to go there, you know? Yeah, and that's why you get the Rust Belt decay. Because again, the flow of resources did significantly change. It became cheaper. Let me find this point. It's right here. It became more profitable to produce the same stuff, for example, automobiles, in, let's say, Asia or Europe or Japan or wherever else, you know? So the civilization kinda left the Rust Belt. Not entirely, but kinda, you know? There are still some signs, but it's definitely, you know, on the downside. It's not the expression, but you know what I mean. Yeah, or think about Brazil with the rubber boom of 1879, 1912. So why did it stop? Well, it's because the British started cultivating, literally like growing, their own rubber trees, in Southeast Asia. Plus, in the middle of the century, the synthetic rubber was invented. Actually, was invented much earlier, but it did not become super prominent until the oil industry kicked in its full glory, so to speak, okay? And that ended the Brazil rubber boom. That's why cities like Manaus, for example, again, they were glorious cities. Like they were much bigger than Buenos Aires, like Rio de Janeiro. Like, in case you don't know, Manaus is in the middle of Amazon River, like very deep into the jungle. But there's a lot of rubber there, okay? Natural rubber trees. I mean, wild rubber trees, I guess. So that's how the city became filthy rich in this time frame. There's a bunch of luxury, super cool homes and stuff. But then it all fell down. So you may see some pictures like this in Manaus. Right now it's kind of rebuilding, but for completely other reasons. I mean, they're cutting the forest there, obviously, and doing other stuff there. But and when I've been to Detroit, by the way, I've seen the same type of imagery there. So it's barbarians killed them. It's obvious. Or maybe, wait. It's aliens, right? Alien invasion ended this glorious civilization. No, it was just the shift in the flow of resources. That's what destroyed this civilization. That's it. Okay? And again, the counterexample is that even if barbarians destroy you, you are absolutely fine. Well, not absolutely, you know. You can rebuild in a couple of decades, max. You know, my city was completely destroyed during World War II. Like there were, I don't know, like 10 or 20 buildings left. And it was completely rebuilt in 1950s. And it actually became much bigger since then, you know? Yeah. Whew. Finally, we arrive at the conclusions, but I'll have a couple of fun tidbits for you even after that, so stay tuned, so to speak. So, civilization, according to once again, this video was concerned, we were talking about the logistical theory of civilization developed by Igor Shkurin, unfortunately deceased. I was basing my narration on this book of his, which I heavily recommend you to read, especially if you can read it in original, but you may read it in machine translation. It's pretty small. You can see the pages are huge. I mean, the font, and it's only 100 pages. Yeah. So, according to this logistical theory of civilization, the civilization is fundamentally different from primeval societies in the way that resources are handled. So, in primeval societies, the resources are produced and consumed in the same spot, pretty much, which we call a village, for the sake of this discussion, whereas in the civilization, the resources are produced and consumed in different places. And these hubs where they are produced and consumed are called cities, right? And therefore, transportation and logistics are key to understanding the civilization. That's why we call it the logistical theory of civilization. And one of the most important points to understand the history of humanity is that up until the second half of 19th century, the main roads were the sea and the rivers. The sea is like the main street of the world, or of the civilization, if you wish. And the rivers are like smaller streets or avenues or whatever. So the civilization comes from the sea or the main street and spreads inland through rivers upstream. Okay? It's just, that's the only way you can transport cargo and people quickly and efficiently enough. Of course you can walk on foot. Of course you can ride a horse. But you wouldn't carry a whole lot with you in this way. Okay? That's the problem. So to establish a firm, thick enough connection, so to speak, between the nodes of your graph, between your cities, you need a thicker cities, which are rivers, all the way until the railroad era. So history, as much as it deals with civilization, is impossible to understand without understanding basic geography or hydrology specifically, because again, these are the trade routes, the rivers. Look at Robert Schoch, even though it's kind of tangential to our topic, but still a good example of misunderstanding of the very basics of school geography can lead you to absolutely insane conclusions in every respect, actually insane. And we also, it would be really great for us to understand the river and ocean faring techniques, like the techniques of boat building, the techniques of ship building. Why did ocean exploration only began in 15th century? Spoiler alert, it was because how is it called actually? Carvel built ships became available, and they only became available because the sawmills powered by water became available, by rivers, by the way, etc., etc., etc. So it's a long chain of causes and effects, right? You cannot have an apple unless you have an apple tree. You cannot have a Mongolian empire unless you have 10,000 furnaces producing good iron, which they didn't, right? Unless you have a good population density to recruit troops from. Unless you have a good food supply, unless you have money to pay these people. Again, in this case, you'd be left in the land of myth and folklore if you don't have any of this, which is sadly, again, 90% of any historical textbook today is, right? Yeah, producing memes like Mongolian Empire. So civilization is actually paradoxically universal in some way, right? I even I call it singular for the most of this narration, right? Because it's kind of the same thing. It has more or less continuous connectivity through the ocean and the river system. And this, again, makes cultural, religious, ideological, racial, any other aspects not matter in the development of civilization. Like today, we may say we have a global civilization because there's global connectivity and everyone is involved in it. It doesn't matter where you're from, what color of your skin, which religion you have, etc. Which holidays do you celebrate. All of this doesn't matter. You're still part of the civilization, all right? In case you're living in a city and not off the grid, so to speak, right? So what matters is the flow of resources. So one funny thing, actually a sad thing if you think about it, I want to add here, is actually Shkurin himself adds, is the ley line theory of Alfred Watkins. I'm pretty sure you've heard about it. Like he had an earlier brochure called Early British Trackways, ironically, by the way, early, right? 1922, and a bigger book, The Old Straight Track from 1925. So we're gonna peek into this one for a little bit, okay? So if I ask you, what is ley line theory about? Okay, you will probably tell me, oh, it's dragon lines, the feng shui, the energy flow around the earth. And I would tell you, no, it's not. It's absolutely not what it is about. What it is about in reality is that, the early civilization had to maintain this sort of connectivity through trade routes, aka rivers mostly, somehow. Well, sometimes these are roads still, right? If the distances aren't very big. The question is how? Imagine a new person arrives to an area and he needs to find a way on his boat, for example, with his cargo, to a nearest trade post, like a small, settlement of some sorts. How would he do that? He needs some sort of road signs, right? He needs to know, where do I turn left or right. So the claim that Watkins made in ley line theory is that these megaliths and mounds and things like that are exactly that. They're road signs in the road network, aka river network, but not only. They're essentially early navigational instruments of civilization, so people wouldn't get lost, so they would find their way into the nearest city. All right? It's just as easy as that. It has nothing to do with any sort of new age energy, quantum vibration, alien Atlantis, you know? It's... let's read him, actually. Once again, I'm linking it. So, early British trackways, 1922. Let's go to the page number 10. This one. Outline of conclusions. What does he say? From the Neolithic, later Flint Age on, past the Roman occupation into a period of decay, all trackways, aka roads, were in straight lines marked out by experts on a sighting system. So you basically needed things like these to know where to go, you know? It's a road sign, literally. Such sighting lines were from natural mountain peak to mountain peak, usually not less than, well, let's say 300 meters. I'm not using feet, I'm sorry. Etc., etc. Such a sighting line or ley. Ley is a sighting line. It means you must see this object to orient using it, right? Would be useless unless some further marking points on the lower ground, etc. be made, right? Secondary sighting points were made. They were constructed either of earth, water, or stone, trees also being planted, sacred wells. These are road signs, guys. This is what the theory is about. It's not about the flow of energy, it's about the flow of people and goods and services. That's it. Period. And it's absolutely logical. Like, how else would you orient if you don't know the area? You need a guide or something, but what if, you know, you just arrived, like you don't know anyone there? Ley is a sighting line. Ley line is a sighting line. It's a network of orientation in the road network. Forgive me for this tautology. It's not where the energy goes. It's where do I go from here? You know, it 100% agrees with logistical theory of civilization. Of course, this you need like, let's say, low resolution signs like these only in the, let's say, underdeveloped stage, right? When the civilization is developed enough, they can use more advanced structures, for example, temples or monasteries, which is exactly how they were used, okay? Because what is a temple or a monastery? It's essentially a combination, it's like a gas station, you know? It has an inn, right? It has a cafe, basically, you know. It has a bank within it because it can store money for you if you're afraid to get robbed or something, etc., etc., etc. Because the church was the main social institute all the way into the 19th century, actually. It was the main administrative buildings. Or in case, like, you know, smaller temples or monasteries along some rivers, they were more like gas stations in modern American understanding, you know. A gas station on a highway is the same as the temple or a monastery on a river. Yeah, sometime in, let's say, 1400s. So, but we'll talk about the role of the church sometime later. Maybe I'll make a video about this. Like how church was quite literally the only societal institute. Because it literally did everything. So, yeah. Unfortunately, again, this absolutely reasonable theory became engulfed in a woo idiocy, you know? And some people have the balls, even to this day, to call this guy a pseudoscientist. Like, again, sorry, I'm very pissed off by things like this. Like, he wasn't, okay? Just read his book, he's perfectly reasonable. Read it seriously, it's a good read. But unfortunately, like, his reputation is absolutely ruined by various degenerates. Again, as I've said in this video about Egypt, this one, ancient aliens is a myth. Modern retards is a fact. That's a sorry state of our society. We live in society, you know. Yeah. So ley line theory is not what you think it is. It's about the road signs on the early road network of civilization, which is the river network, and maybe sometime the roads proper, where the distances aren't that big. Yeah. Well, last two things I want to mention. First of all, you may examine how so-called Inca roads were actually built by natives of South America and Central America under the supervision of European colonists to service the silver mines. Like, you can examine the logistics. Like, look at the map of Inca roads logistically. Why are they so suspiciously connecting the silver mines to main ports, for example? Etc., etc., etc. So you can logistically even analyze things, difficult things like that. And what is the most difficult thing like that is the problem of Rome, right? We've already mentioned, I think, or maybe I didn't, that everyone likes to ask this question: why did Rome fall? Well, first of all, it didn't, but let's keep this to ourselves. Let's ask a more interesting question. How did Rome become great? Like, can you make an analysis of this sort that I made for New York, for example, for Rome? What, like for New York, long story short, right? How did it become great? It, with the help of Erie Canal, it gained access to all of these resources, right? And further down even. How did Rome become great? You can, of course, come up with Tolkien explanations with Silmarillion. You can say, well, they were sons of Jupiter, you know. They just become great because they had passionarity, you know, the strong moral stance, or some idiot bullshit like this, right? But if we are reasonable, like, really, how did it become great? That's a great question. No pun intended. Like, why did civilization come to Rome? Because, for example, here it needed, like, roughly speaking, beaver pelts, lumber, and agricultural products, right? That's what civilization came here for initially, at least initially, right? What was Rome famous with? What was the resource that Rome had that nobody else had? Huh? That's kind of a homework I want to give you. Think about this question. I have an answer. I'm not saying it's the answer, but I do have an answer to this question. But this answer would allow us to, let's say, significantly revise the datings, okay? Let me just end on this cliffhanger. I'm not gonna tell it to you, at least yet.
Mongolian nomads have minted coins. If you wish to support me, please consider joining my Patreon. That is patreon.com/philosopher. See the link in the description. Or if you have a scientific theory of your own and you'd like my help in developing it, please join my alternative science coaching program, also available through Patreon.
A 1, a 2, a 1, 2, 3, 4.
Nomads minted coins. 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 Nomads minted, nomads minted, nomads minted coins. Hey, Mongolian, Mongolian, nomads minted coins. Mongolian, Mongolian, nomads minted coins. Hey, Mongolian, Mongolian, nomads minted coins. Mongolian, Mongolian, nomads minted. A coin.